I'm pleased to be joined today by Congressman Jeff Davis from Kentucky. Congressman, good to have you here.
Great to be with you, Nick.
You're here today to participate in a conference at where you're going to talk about the REINS Act, which is some legislation that you are sponsoring. Tell us what the REINS Act is and what it's supposed to do.
Well, it's H.R. 3765, the Regulations of the Executive in Need of Scrutiny Act, and really what the acronym is designed to do is give a picture of pulling back on the unbridled growth of government. Since I've been in Congress the last 6 years, I've seen many times where regulations of very significant magnitude are coming out of the agency community with no legislative oversight, or at a minimum very little, as a result of either lack of oversight or legislative language that's nebulous. And we've seen it become a regime within virtually every major agency community where it in effect is taxation or legislation by regulation without the oversight of Congress and ultimately the accountability to the people. Personally, we've seen this impact our economy in the Ohio Valley in many, many ways. And after an $800 million consent decree on 3 counties for an unneeded stormwater compliance regime a few years ago, we had a lot of local outcry. I was certainly opposed to this, and one of my constituents asked me a question that really began the genesis of the REINS Act. He said, "Why can't you guys vote on this stuff?" And I thought $800 million is certainly well within the range of appropriated legislation. It should be authorized by the Congress, and the people had no recourse. We have towns in our communities, or in our district, for example, whose budgets are actually significantly less than what the EPA compliance would be. We look at no child left.
And that was an EPA
this
rule that was.
Yes, this was an EPA. This was an EPA mandated rule. We see this across the board in many ways, dealing with various permutations of impact on small business with remediation issues. We have another similar impact. No Child Left Behind has a huge unfunded mandate with Individuals with Disability and Education Act funding that was committed at 40%, but typically runs in our region at 11 to 13%. Again, this is taxation by regulation, where local communities should be able to hold someone in the federal government accountable. They don't have that option. We could look at any number of pieces of regulatory literature. But at the end of the day, we went to work and came back and began assessing how would we, one, achieve transparency, accountability, and a better check and balance to limit the growth of the executive without the consent of the people, ultimately, and in a nonpartisan way that would allow to restore power to the legislature. We've seen significant transfers of power to the executive with TARP, with the health care bill, if the cap and trade regime were to go through, with the court findings, and the court has simply, in my mind, taken a position of hands off. It's going to come back to action by the legislature and allow the voices of the people to be heard. So what we did, we went to work after that idea was launched, found a place in the law, in the Government Reform Act, and from there, what it would mandate is simply this: defining any major rule, which is a rule of $100 million or more in cumulative economic impact. Once that's scored by OIRA, would have to come back up to Capitol Hill, would be in a standalone up or down vote in the House, in the Senate, under joint resolution, and then have to be signed by the President for that major rule to become law. And ultimately, I can tell you many of my colleagues who might agree to vote for something with nebulous legislative language and then got thrown over the wall and made into something like this will no longer be able to say, oh, well, we can't do anything about that. Now they're going to be on the line for these significant actions that impact all of our communities.
You mentioned a couple of examples. What are some prominent, you mentioned No Child Left Behind, presumably some of the healthcare rules. What are some other prominent examples of major rulemaking with sizable economic impact that would, say, fall under this, where it would then come back to Congress for Congress to actually have a vote on it and be on the record supporting or voting down these rules?
I'll give you an example in the healthcare world. In the FDA world, we are dealing with, in effect, much of the healthcare agency community in Washington, D.C. is founded on a system architecture and information management architecture in the 1960s in the 21st century economy. It takes almost $800 million to bring any pharmaceutical to market. And I think we should have very strong standards, very high standards for safety and soundness in the implementation of these drugs. But much of the cost is driven by overhead that's mandated by regulations that don't necessarily touch the context of that. Another local one that many of our business people, holiday travelers, are experiencing right now is in the Transportation Security Administration. Many of the rules that are being promulgated, and I'm speaking separate from the area of simple emergency measures and short-term for security, which REINS would have room for. We're looking at significant impact on the economy where, for example, the industry partners, a wide range of perspectives, a wide range of issues surrounding that haven't necessarily been vetted in public, but were unilaterally decided.
We had one of the areas I cover here is media telecommunications, and just yesterday the chairman of the FCC, Julius Janikowski, announced that he was intending to push forward with net neutrality regulations and the internet ecosystem, and that would have certainly, I think, over the $100 million threshold. So that too might be the kind of thing that then at least would come back to Congress.
And I think that particularly when we deal with civil liberties, free speech, free markets, anytime there is a regulation promulgated, there is an overhead cost to compliance. Another area that you can look at are the Center for Medicare Services regulations that are promulgated out into the healthcare community, create circumstances where we simply are driving increase in costs and reducing capacity. General practitioners in lower income areas that have a high proportion of Medicare or Medicaid patients are walking away now from people they would otherwise be able to treat because of the additional burdens that are placed upon them for simply paperwork compliance. Same thing, HIPAA. I came out, I was actually doing a hospital mini internship for 3 days in 2003. The week HIPAA implemented, it was one of those ironic moments. And every medical practice, every physician that I walked with during that time was set into a circumstance where their administrative compliance burden was so overwhelming. Again, they had to hire additional people, thus driving their cost, just to comply with the paperwork. It wasn't their value adding. So the more you scratch, the more you begin to find in this complexity of not simply how many times we're taxed, but how many layers of cost that hurt American competitiveness, hurt the competitiveness of our economy and our communities in the global economy by these hidden regulations.
You've done a nice job explaining, I think, what the legislation is designed to do and what it would do. It strikes me that if you go back and look at the history, we've had the rise of an administrative state starting in the New Deal all the way through to today, where enormous amount of economic activity is regulated there. You're now talking about bringing that back to Congress. That's a big shift. Do you think Congress is ready to bring all of this in? It's going to move all the lobbying apparatus, focusing more on Congress, all the level of expertise that members and staff will have to acquire to deal with this. Is Congress ready to bring this all back in?
Well, I think the more important point is the American people are ready for Congress to bring this back in. The way I think John Boehner's comments right after the election were very appropriate. The election this November was a restraining order on the United States government. And what we need to do is look at processes that don't remove, this is not to remove standards, common standards, regulations where there are common cause and there's necessity. What we're really talking about is having consensus and context. Dry cleaners should not be treated the same way as Dow Chemical. We're dealing with local communities, real people who are impacted by that. And I would say yes. And I would say certainly with the number of new members that we've gotten who are coming in out of the business community, out of healthcare, out of the military, understand what it's like to be on the receiving end of a regulation as opposed to perhaps well-intentioned drafting based on poor or nebulous legislation. I think the other benefit of this is that by having this check and balance, there will still be experts in the agency communities, but they will have to be accountable, A, to the Congress, and the more important aspect of this is I believe that rather than getting deal compromises where people are voting on legislative language where they think it means one thing but it's wide open to be interpreted in a different way will cause us to have more succinct and more eloquent bills that will be very close to what the end statutes would have to be.
Final question for you. You mentioned the 2010 election. Obviously, Republicans gained control of the House, will have control as of next month. And made significant gains in the Senate, and your co-sponsor of this bill is Senator Jim DeMint.
Yes.
President Obama still controls the White House. What is the legislative state of affairs with this? Have you talked to anyone in the administration? Do you know how they feel about it? What are the odds for success, in your view, for this legislation?
Well, I think if the president wants to be true to the statements that he made in his inaugural speech, and I sat there and I listened to that and I walked away with a different impression. And I felt if he were committed to implement a post-partisan government, one that works with the American people to bring forth the will of the American people, it would be in his best interest to do this, because it shows he's bringing demonstrative change that local communities will have impact and be heard in their unique and specific needs. It will allow a dialogue. It will restore, I think, a balance that has been lost for many years in Washington, D.C. And I would be hopeful that he would do that. And if we step away in a true post-partisan environment, it allows a mechanism that will always provide accountability. It will provide a voice for the minority, and more importantly, if you have a majority on the Hill, or majority of members around a particular idea, I think more accurately in a post-partisan environment, majorities around issues, an agency that chose to perhaps even abrogate the will of its own political appointees and president and go in a different direction would no longer be able to do that. We saw this with the EPA administrator in the Bush administration, who just simply directed his subordinates to not respond to the calls of Congress. I think that's a problem. And we fought a revolution once over this issue of the tyranny of a central government. And I think really all we have to do are put some controls in place, this being one of several, that would simply put a governor on the engine and say, or not unlike an assembly line in a manufacturing facility that has an automatic shutdown. It turns on a red light, says we have a problem at this workstation. Let's stop and take a look at that so the overall product can be good. And I'm confident that this should be not only bipartisan but nonpartisan and give us transparency and accountability.
Okay, my guest today is Congressman Jeff Davis of Kentucky. The legislation we're talking about is the REINS Act. That's R-E-I-N-S, and you can find out more information at your website. What's your web address?
It's www.jeffdavis.house.gov, and that's Geoffdavis.
Great. Well, thank you for being here.
Great, thank you.